Weathered and worn with unlimited potential. Today on Truck Tech, we take delivery on our latest Project Low and Slow. Find out what's in store for this 53-year-old C10. Plus, RedTide ties up some loose ends, including gearing, brakes, and a brand new grill.
Hey, welcome to Truck Tech. As you can see, we're outside the shop today with a good surprise waiting for us.
One of the golden rules in the automotive world is to never purchase a vehicle sight unseen. Today we have done just that. We have a new project truck that just showed up, and this is the first time we get to see it in person. Man, I think we lucked out so far.
Yeah, let's see
she's
what we
looking
got.
good. This
Yeah, I
thing is
believe
awesome.
so.
Well, as you guys can tell, this is a 1965 Chevrolet C10, and it is wearing a beautiful, original, 100% authentic patina treatment.
It is nice.
We searched for some time to find a clean truck for our next build. And this one comes to us from Marshall, Texas. It's very solid since it hasn't been eaten up by road salt, snow, or humidity. You know, of course, you've got to have the old blanket-style seat cover to complete
wouldn't
the
have it
package.
any other way, I really would.
All those years in the sun have given this truck a unique and one-of-a-kind look. You know, probably most kids today wouldn't even know how to drive this truck.
Probably
Three-speed
not.
on the column.
Probably not.
Actually, one of the first trucks I learned how to drive, 69 Chevy, K20, 3 on the tree, 6-cylinder.
There you go.
Brings back some memories, man. Right now, it has a 305 under the hood. We're unsure of what engine it had originally, but it was likely a 283. We'll get this truck inside and take a closer look. So right off the bat, it's fairly obvious this truck wasn't just pulled out of a hayfield somewhere. Along the way, somebody's done a few odds and ends to get this truck running and driving. And the first giveaway, well, it's the fuel tank. On this era of truck, it was originally mounted behind the driver's seat. In fact, ours is still there, but it's probably just full of rust, so it would have been easier just to mount an aftermarket tank behind the rear axle.
Now, one cool factor is the rear suspension on this truck utilizes a truck or trailing arm style suspension. Now, we know this has performance potential because it's something that NASCAR actually used in the past as a certain style of suspension. One other thing you may have noticed is this truck sits a little lower to the ground than a stock one would. Now, they've done this by heating up the coil spring so it sags just a little bit to get that stance nice and low. Not the proper way, but it's something we'll handle.
We got very lucky underneath the truck because the cab floors and rockers, everything's in pretty good shape, especially considering it's over 55 years old. The only exceptions, there's a couple of small holes in the floor and rocker on the passenger side.
Now, we like the fact that this transmission utilizes the shifter on the steering column. We want to do something similar, even though it might not be this exact one.
Now, there's a lot of great potential in this truck. It's really solid underneath. But before we tear this thing apart, we're going to get it out on the road and see how it drives. Whenever you buy a project truck or a second-hand engine, the motor's definitely going to have some miles on it. More often than not, the seller is going to claim that it was driven by a little old lady to church on Sunday mornings and it has only 10,000 miles on it. But the real story is probably more like it was driven by a 16-year-old kid and has had the snot beaten out of it. So how do you know what the true story is? Because the health of an engine can definitely affect how much you should pay for it. So today, I'm going to show you a couple of quick tests that you can do to easily give a health report to an older engine. If the engine is still in the vehicle, or you can start it up on a stand, the first thing I do is start the engine and run it for a little bit and see what comes out of the tailpipe. Now, hopefully you don't see anything, but if you do see some light bluish smoke, that's a pretty good indication the engine could be burning oil, either through the piston rings or worn valve seals. This one looks pretty clean, but there is a more scientific way to see how your engine is doing. A compression tester is a tool that everybody should have in their arsenal, and it'll tell you a lot about the internal health of your engine. As the crankshaft rotates and the piston moves up and down, it'll trap air from the atmosphere and compress it. Now, in order to compress the air enough to make the engine run properly, you have to have a lot of parts that are working up to par. You have to have a good finish on the cylinder wall, good piston rings, good valve seals, and of course a good head gasket to seal all that pressure inside the engine. Now, depending on what style of engine you have and what modifications you might have done, the reading might vary greatly. But for a stock small block Chevy like ours, we expect a reading somewhere between 140 and 180 psi if everything is working perfectly. Now, the first step to conducting a compression test is pulling all the spark plugs. To let the engine crank over quickly, each of the spark plugs need to be removed from the head. Next, the power going to the ignition coil needs to be disconnected, and the throttle plate needs to be held open for the duration of the test. With the adapter threaded into the head and the gauge connected,
All right, hit it.
we'll crank over the engine until the reading on the gauge stabilizes.
Okay. About 140.
And record the value. We'll repeat this process for all 8 cylinders. So we measured a range between 140 and 170 psi on all 8 cylinders, with the average being 157. Now that's not great news, but it's also not the end of the world. It just means that 305 is worn out, but at least we know what we're starting with inside that engine.
Next, one baloney. Burn!
PowerNation is brought to you by Rock Auto.
New Chevy and an old Chevy.
So he's passing us, we're not passing him. Feel the bumps.
She's a little
Feel the
uneven.
bumps.
You know, this was just before the days of airbags and traction control and ABS, and man, we're lucky to have an FM radio.
Don't think it works, but we got one, so that's good.
Oh, she's sputtering a little bit.
Dude, I'm surprised it's got that pull though like that.
Yeah, well, like we said, I don't think that engine's original. It says it's a 305.
No, but that transmission's about this big.
You know, what I'm noticing now that we're getting on this kind of curvy back road, this steering is like, basically you kind of think of where you want to go.
And just say, yeah.
You can just guess. You can point this wheel anywhere. It's going where it wants to. So what do we do to a truck like this? I mean, it's got a beautiful finish on the outside. It runs fairly decent for what it is. I mean, what can we mess with?
Maybe we get the heater working to start.
Okay, that's a good point. Start with a heater.
You know, man, I don't think we need to go super crazy on horsepower or anything. Let's get it exciting for sure.
You know, one of my things is I've said this a lot before, is I hate doing stuff that is common and that everybody has done. You know, the first thing people would say is, all right, throw an LS in it, or it's because it already has a small block, well, you know, put a newer small block in it or something like that. To me, that just, it's not exciting. You know, what about maybe like a 6-cylinder? You know, they had a lot of
Straight 6.
yeah, 235s, 250s, you know, the 292. You know, we could try to look around to see if we can find one of those.
Yeah, maybe get on the bigger end of the straight 6s with that 292 range and build that up, do something a little different with it. I don't know.
So the biggest question everybody's going to ask us is, are you going to leave the patina? So let's get that out of the way right now.
I think the answer to that is yes. I think we're leaving it. We're not touching it. Maybe we'll have a little surprise here or there.
Yeah, you know, it took the last 54, 55 years for this truck to kind of earn its color and earn basically how it looks, which is really unique and hard to duplicate. So I say we just leave it.
Yeah, I'm down with that.
All right.
What do you say we burn the rubber off these bad boys?
Why not?
Oh, yeah. Don't stop, baby. Even got smoke on that one.
That's the old one tire fire.
One tire wonder, we call that.
Next, RedTide returns for a gear-matched rear.
There's a lot of potential in this 65 C10, so we've ordered some parts and we'll pick back up with it in a couple of weeks. Now it's time to turn our attention to Project RedTide, our '88 Chevy K1500, which started out life as a four-wheel drive pickup. Since then, we swapped the transfer case and front differential, and now it's a lowered all-wheel drive sport truck.
And that front diff we installed is a 4:10 gear ratio setup. This will give us quick acceleration off the line, but also nice cruising RPMs at that highway speed. All we need to do, since it's all-wheel drive, is make sure that rear matches the front.
So today we're going to swap gears in that 8.5-inch 10-bolt, and along the way we're going to install some better brakes and a sway bar up front. But we'll get started by tearing apart that rear end. Rather than just re-gear to match the front,
Got her.
we're taking this opportunity to do some upgrades along the way. We'll make the rear end stronger and improve its traction at the same time. Many people think that a 410 and a 411 are the same thing. Uh-oh, it was empty. But they have different tooth counts. You can actually order both for the 10-bolt, so make sure you pay attention to what you're getting. We grabbed all the parts that we'll need to rebuild the rear end in our K1500 from Summit Racing, and we started out with a 410-to-1 ring and pinion gear set that'll perfectly match what's in the front differential. The ring gear is going to be attached to this Detroit True Track helical gear style limited slip differential, which has a perfect split in power between the rear wheels, giving maximum traction on the street. Now, in '88, there were several different options for spline counts on the 10-bolt rear end. We're going to upgrade to the stronger 30 spline, which means we need a different axle shaft to attach to it. So we grab these Moser 30 spline 6-lug axles that are a direct fit into our 10 bolts housing. We also grabbed all the remaining parts that we'll need to complete the installation, like a forged pinion yoke with a stronger 1350 U-joint, an installation kit with all the shims, bearings, seals, and hardware that we'll need, and to strengthen the rear end just a little bit more, we grabbed a Moser differential cover with built-in carrier cap supports. We'll get started by installing the ring gear onto the carrier.
While LT continues with gear matching the rear, I moved up front to improve this truck's stopping power. And since we've more than doubled the horsepower with our LS swap, these factory components just won't do. Summit Racing offers a few choices for brake replacements. We chose this upgraded kit that has red powder-coated single piston calipers, carbon fiber ceramic infused brake pads, and also zinc-plated, drilled, and slotted rotors, which will ensure better cooling and also improve pad contact. During teardown, I noticed the brake line of the frame showed some wear, so I picked up some factory replacements for both sides. Body roll on these first-gen Chevys were notorious, and I'll tackle that after LT buttons up the rear.
One unique thing about the 10-bolt is the ring gear bolts are left-hand thread. A small dab of thread locker will hold them in place. They are torqued to spec, and the carrier bearings are pressed onto the carrier. Then, the new bearing races are driven into the housing. There are a few critical steps to setting up the ring and pinion, and I always start with the stock pinion shim and a setup bearing to get a baseline. The rear end gets assembled temporarily, so we can measure backlash and run a pattern check, both of which will tell us what needs to be adjusted. We're going to add 10 thousandths of shim to the pinion, press on the bearing, permanently install the pinion into the housing, and tighten the nut until proper bearing preload is reached. Then the carrier goes in, we'll measure backlash, and run a final pattern check. Now that the hard work is done, the 30 spline axles slide into place, and they're held there with the stock C-clips and the axle spacer. The retaining spacer and snap ring locks it all in place, and it gets sealed up with our new diff cover. the cap supports get preloaded, finishing up the rear end.
Next, ditch your dated grill for a modern look.
PowerNation is brought to you by Rock Auto.
Hey, LT, you might give me a hand with this rear sway bar?
Oh, absolutely.
Welcome back to Truck Tech. To keep Project RedTide level while cornering, we're adding an anti-roll or sway bar out back. It first connects to the axles with a provided bracket. We picked up this bolt-on kit from Summit Racing, and all we have to do is mark and drill a 1/2-inch hole in the side of the frame. And the end links tie it all together.
Out front, the original sway bar is long gone, so it gets an upgrade with this 1.1/8" bar made from 4140 chrome moly, which bolts to the stock location.
One of the last steps to completing our all-wheel drive conversion is getting power from the transfer case to both differentials. And since we swapped an engine, transmission, and transfer case, none of the original links will work anymore. So we called up Tom Wood's custom drive shafts and gave him a few measurements. The rear shaft has a 32 spline yoke to match up with the NV149, and a stronger than stock 1350 style U-joint to attach to our forged yoke. Since the front shaft will be getting power all the time, we spec'd out a double cardan design which will stand up to the high-speed abuse which we have planned.
Our 88 Chevy is going to get a few cosmetic upgrades before she rolls out of here. So we went to Classic Industries to pick up a few restoration parts to help improve the look of this truck. It starts with this dual headlamp composite grille from a 98 GMC. We just prefer the look of this compared to that 88 dull chrome piece. Out back, we're ditching these dated style taillights for these LED Euro style replacements. And Classic Industries also sent us new headlamps, front corner markers, and painted side mirrors to round out our upgrades. Now, let's get started by prepping the grille. Later model GM trucks of this era had body color matched grills, so that is what we're after with RedTide. I'll mask the center section so we can keep the black and chrome intact. Then it's on to the boot, where I'll apply wax and grease remover, isopropyl alcohol for an anti-static agent, followed by a coat of Dupli-Color adhesion promoter. I'm mixing up some epoxy primer and catalyst designed to give our plastic parts a good foundation and fill in any imperfections. All we need is one coat. For base, we're going with a single stage paint as opposed to a base coat clear coat system. Because our truck was previously sprayed with single stage, and our goal is to come as close as we can. Single Source in Nashville, Tennessee has sent us a polyurethane Victory Red. This will provide color, strength, and shine built into one application. It mixes 6 parts base, 1 part activator, and 1 part hardener. When setting up your gun, it's always a good idea to refer to the data sheet of the product you're spraying. This will give you a good starting point for air pressure settings. I sprayed this one at about 25 psi, but at the end of the day, it all comes down to personal preference. I'm going to give it 3 coats. I'll do a light coat on the first, followed by 2 full wet coats. There is no need to sand down any orange peel because it will better match the current texture of the truck. Also, we will polish out any imperfections later on.
While Austin was out in the paint booth finishing up the front end for Project RedTide, I had some time to build an intake tube for the 5.3 that we have swapped underneath the hood. I started out with some 4-inch aluminum elbows that we had kicking around the shop, and I TIG welded them together, leaving enough room for the electric cooling fans and the stock upper radiator hose. And the 4-inch diameter is going to flow plenty of air to feed that 400 horsepower 5.3.
So that's what you've been doing this whole time.
Oh, you know, you got to keep busy doing something. Tell you what, though, I really dig this Victory Red. It's going to pop outside.
I agree, man. What do you say we grab this thing and see how it looks?
All right. Yeah, man, I love that GMC front end. It's going to totally update this truck, bringing it into the 21st century.
That'll work for me. So this about brings us to a close to this project. A few odds and ends to wrap up. As you can see, we got that C10 rolled in the back, and we're excited to show you what we have in store for it.
Absolutely. And if you guys want any more information on Project RedTide or any of the other trucks that we build, be sure to check out PowerNationTV.com. Thanks for watching Truck Tech, and we'll see you guys next time.
Yeah, man, you want to help me throw these lights on?
Absolutely. I'll tell you what, these GMC 500 are my absolute favorite.